Is that better? It's a great honor to be here with you in Lincoln. This is my first visit to Nebraska and my first visit to UNL. And it has been wonderful. I'm glad that this time the weather cooperated and brought sunshine. And I'm going to bring some tea. I would like to thank Professors Jones and Professors Abel and Dreyer and Vacher and Professor Damien, what is it? Pfister, for making this visit happen, and all the various programs and departments who also are listed as co-sponsors. It is a great honor to be here. My talk tonight is titled, Going Home Ain't Always Easy, Performance and Ethics in the Black Gay South, in which I discuss the politics of representation when conducting research on marginalized groups through using performance ethnography and oral histories as methods. Along the way, I will share with you a little history about how it is I came to collect oral histories of Black gay Southerners, why I decided to create a performance based on these oral histories, and finally, to introduce some of these men to you through performance. There's a well-known cliche that suggests home is where the heart is. For me, this could not be truer, for although I currently live in the Midwest, as you do, my Southern roots, such as they are constantly showing. Since my move to Chicago from Durham, North Carolina in 2000, I've had the good fortune to meet and make many good friends. Indeed, many of the friends that my partner and I have met over the past decade are also transplanted Southerners who moved up south because of a new job opportunity, as I did, to try out city life in a place somewhere besides Atlanta, to attend college, or to escape the South. Whatever our reasons for leaving the South never left us. Whether it's that alien accent that emerges when talking to our parents over the phone, those small country ways that we hang on to no matter how cityfied we become, or that longing for the soft-spoken gentility whispered from the lips of elders that can take the edge off of any stressful day. We are our region's children. No amount of migration will change that. I was reminded of this when I returned to the South to conduct interviews with Black gay men who were born, raised, and continue to live in the South for my book, Sweet Tea, Black Gay Men of the South and Oral History. Listening to those men's stories not only grounded me, but it also took me back to divinely remembered places in my own history. They were telling my story while narrating their own. Stories that remind me of summertime in the foothills of western North Carolina, when folks in my neighborhood sat on their porches and spun stories for hours on end. But going home ain't always easy, especially if you are an openly gay, Black Southern academic returning to do research on a population that, in some ways, wishes to remain hidden in plain sight. Navigating the vast terrain of identity politics within the context of a place like the South proved to be tricky, even though, or perhaps especially because, I am a Southerner. There were times when I betrayed the codes of Southern civility I had been brought up to believe were the proper way to carry oneself. At other times, however, my own politics and preconceived notions about what it means to be out forced me to confront the complexities of how one's public face is always already implicated in one's private space. The research for Sweet Tea arose out of my interest in both valorizing the voices of a demographic of men who seldom get a chance to speak about their experiences as Southerners in relation to their sexuality and race, and, I suppose, out of my longing for validation of my own story of being a Black, queer Southerner. Over the course of 18 months, I collected narratives of 77 Black gay Southerners from the ages of 19 to 93. On the occasion of each of these interviews, which were mostly conducted in the men's homes, I found my own life story in dialogic tension with their stories. Their story was and was not my story. The stories about growing up poor, being brought up in the church, trying to pray my gayness away, singing in the church choir, and being called a sissy rang true to my experience. The stories about molestation, living a transgendered life, being put out of the house, being homeless, and being sexually promiscuous were not as close to my experience, however. And yet, these stories, too, were familiar, and certainly ones in which I was implicated. Rather than approach this research employing a traditional text-based historiography, I felt it was important to employ oral histories as the key methodology. As a Southerner, I have the gift of gab and that of graciousness, to say nothing of the Southern Baptist Christian ethos that guides my every move, despite my desire to have it otherwise. Therefore, I knew that not only would I be comfortable actually interacting with these men, but I also knew that I could get them to open up to me in a way that they might not open up to a non-Southerner, a non-Black person, or even a self-identified non-Christian. Oral histories in some way provide an easier route into the lives of sexual dissidents, especially in the face of archivists, families of deceased queers, and other holders of queer history who are reluctant or unwilling to allow access to materials. My instinct was to approach the living, to interact with these men in their own environs, to provide a fuller picture of the lives they performatively narrated. In one of his seminal essays entitled "Performing as a Moral Act: Ethical Dimensions of the Everyday of the Ethnography of Performance," Dwight Conquergood not only outlines the contours of what constitutes an ethical methodological approach to the ethnography of performance, he also presents a moral imperative for ethnographers to engage in what he coined as dialogic performance. Disavowing the various pitfalls of performative stances toward the other, including, and these are his categories, the custodian's ripoff, the enthusiast's infatuation, the skeptic's cop-out, and the curator's exhibitionism. Conquergood advocates that performance ethnographers performatively engage the other, quote, as a way of having intimate conversation with other people and cultures. Instead of speaking about them, one speaks to and with them, end quote. Supplanting his apt and off-cited quote that opening and interpreting lives is very different from opening and closing books. Conquergood was committed to an ethical stance toward ethnographic methods as well as performance praxis, that is, a call to action in the pursuit of social justice for the disenfranchised. Ethnography, cultural studies, and performance studies have all experienced many shifts and turns since Conquergood's incisive essay. Conquergood himself began to recast the notion of dialogism, suggesting that conversation and dialogue were not sufficient tropes to describe the differential power relations between researcher and the research. Indeed, that the ethnographic encounter is a site of contestation and negotiation, leading him to coin the term co-performative witnessing, to describe the ways in which the researcher and the researched are co-actors who are invested in the meaning-making process, but whose goals and line of vision are rife with social, cultural, and political investments. What remains in Conquergood's work, however, is a commitment to performance as a critical method for mining the ways in which the disenfranchised make meaning of their lives. To construe this research as co-performance means not only acknowledging that both the researcher and the narrators are performing for one another, it also entails paying attention in a way that engages the bodily presence of both the researcher and the research in the moment of the narrative event. This methodology, according to D. Madison, requires that, quote, you not only do what the subject does, but you are intellectually, relationally, and emotionally invested in their symbol-making practices and social strategies as you experience with them a range of yearnings and desires. Co-performance is a doing with deep attention to and with others, end quote. Thus, it was also important to me that I conduct an oral history, and I talked about this a little bit early on with the graduate students. And so it was important to me that I do an oral history project that would take advantage of my training in performance studies and ethnography for the sensuousness of performance ethnography, the smell, taste, touch, sight, and sounds of the cultural space of the other, is also a part of the Southern way. Critical performance ethnography alters the traditional relationship between researcher and subject, demanding an ethical response from the researcher in witnessing and validating the narrative of the interviewee. Instead of the traditional hierarchical positions, the encounter is analogous to an invitation to dinner at a Southern home, in which the researcher is the guest and is asked to help by shelling peas, chop onions, or set the table. I was the invited dinner guest, and in some instances, I mean this literally, I ate very well watching these interviews. I was the dinner guest of these Black gay Southerners who wished to share their life histories. I did more than attentively listen to their narrative performances. My presence actually validated and affirmed their stories. This was not a one-way exchange, however. It was a conversation, which is why, unlike other oral histories in which the interviewer's voice has been excised to create a sense of an uninterrupted story, I, in many instances, retain the questions I asked that prompted these narratives. I also retain many of the narrator's stutters, pauses, and tangents to capture their voices in a way that did not render their speech sterile, and to capture the performative nature of Southern speech in general, and Black gay vernacular speech specifically. Their stories also validated my own life story as a Southern-born and raised Black gay man. These stories filled the air of living rooms, dining rooms, sunrooms, hotels, bars, coffee shops. The pregnant pauses filled only by the sounds of clocks ticking, turned down television sets, or stereos as the anticipation of what words to say next or what question to ask was stifled by a previous indelible reverie. To be sure, not all of our communions were romantic expeditions. Tears, contempt, condescension, and indifference were all very real emotions in that space we call performance. But it is the experience of co-performative critical ethnography that makes it such a valuable tool in engaging the lives of the other, the self and other in each other's eyes. When I began conducting these oral histories, I was not considering adapting them for the stage, and some of you might find that surprising, but it is true. It was not until about a year into the research, and after meeting such colorful storytellers, that I knew that these stories could not live on the page alone. Initially, I considered adapting a script from the oral histories and casting a show of 8 to 12 actors. After more thought, however, I decided not to turn the performance into a production with multiple cast members and instead make the show a solo piece, with me performing excerpts from various narratives. Pragmatically, I knew the show would be more mobile if it were only me, and I also felt that I had a closer understanding of the circumstances and the context of each of the interviews and the nonverbal cues that accompanied each interview. I also made this decision because I saw it as an opportunity to use performance to ask larger questions about how to stage ethnographic fieldwork. For instance, how does moving the narratives from the printed page and the mostly private space of a reader to the stage with a public audience alter their meaning? What does the dramatization of the researcher's relationship to the research and to the audience reveal that the book version only implies? What are the ethics of performing these narratives in the absence of the narrators? How does a researcher keep the focus on the men and their stories rather than the researcher and his talents as a performer? While working through those questions, I began to think about some of the contemporary issues in performance ethnography and how my particular research and ethical conundrum is not an anomaly, but one that other performance ethnographers have grappled with over the years. Nonetheless, I want to use the occasion of my own research to revisit, once again, the relationship between the self and other in performance ethnography. While we have, for the most part, moved beyond the positivistic ethnographic models of modernity and contemporarily taking for granted a self-reflexive mode of inquiry, what are the trouble spots of self-reflexivity? In other words, when does reflexivity threaten the critical in the term critical performance ethnography? By colonizing the space of the other for which the research is supposed to account. In speaking on this subject, Soyini Madison writes, quote, "We understand that our subjectivity is an inherent part of research, but in critical ethnography, it is not my exclusive experience. That is, autobiography, travel writing, or memoir, or what some people call autoethnography. I contend that critical ethnography is always a meeting of multiple sides in an encounter with and among the others, one in which there is negotiation and dialogue towards substantial and viable meanings that make a difference in the other's world," end quote. Here, Madison makes a distinction between what she sees as critical ethnography and autoethnography by linking critical ethnographic practice with political and social advocacy for and a steady focus on the other. I wonder then, in a case such as mine, if there is a way to conjoin critical ethnography and autoethnography in a way that adheres to Madison's call to make a difference in the other's world. In her short but deftly crafted 2006 essay, Making New Directions in Performance Ethnography, Della Pollock outlines what she believes are 5 productive directions for performance ethnography research. They are international, immersive, incorporative, integrative, and interventionist. For the sake of my discussion here, I want to focus on 2 of these directions, immersive and integrative, as they relate to my current oral history project on Black gay men of the South, and in order to demonstrate both the uses and limits of performance ethnography. Pollock describes immersive ethnography as an ethnography in which, quote, the self-subject of the researcher is immersed in the co-subject, entangled with, even ravished by the co-creative process, such that the subjectivity of the researcher is diffused within, even to the point of disappearing into the field's body. Accordingly, we no longer see the scholar, I, at work, but we certainly feel her passion, his grace, end quote. Pollock's missive here encouraged me to think more critically about my engagement with the men I interviewed in relationship to the politics of representation in the site of performance. That is, when I made the conscious choice to move these narratives from the page to the stage, how the co-creative process might be foregrounded such that my subjectivity is diffused, and yet the audience might feel my passion and grace. The move I make to incorporate as best I can this immersive stance is to play clips of part of the interview during the performance. In this way, the audience gets to hear the men's voices in relation to mine. The other performance choice I made actually draws on the aesthetics of oral interpretation, whereby the other is not fully embodied, but rather suggest it through voice and small gesture and the presence of the text. In the performance, for instance, I never allow the audience to fully suspend disbelief. The script is ever present, and I include the questions I ask of the interviewee. Now, I've done this performance over 100 times now, so I don't really need the script. It's there symbolically. I find that this performance method allows for a new way of documenting ethnographic material that doesn't fully accommodate the aestheticization of cultural performance in ways that undermine the complexity of the intersubjective experience shared between researcher and researched. On the other hand, I'm not fully convinced that my performance accomplishes Pollock's call for an interventionist ethnography. Her formulation of interventionist ethnography revolves around the notion of empathy as a taken-for-granted objective of performance studies. She writes, quote, "To the extent that empathy in any way reflects desire for unmediated identification, it may be implicated in the rank nativism it hermeneutically hopes to combat. It may in turn foreclose on critique by holding the researcher and his or her audience close, or as close as desire for unmediated knowledge will permit, whether because of the possibility of perpetuating racisms, limiting critique, or generating more productive relationships between ethnographer, field, subjects, and reader, viewers, participants. It seems worthwhile to investigate and potentially intervene on the presumed value of empathy in performance ethnography," end quote. Here, Pollock's point is well taken. For while it is true that one of the goals of many of us engaged in ethnographic research, we desire the audience with whom we share this work to be moved to act, speak, or to critically reflect on the representation of the lives presented before them. I would hope, however, that empathy as avowed through unmediated identification would be mitigated through the very process of performativity. That is, the fact that performance is always already mediated through the lens of the spectator's own social location, may interfere with an uncritical empathetic leap from self to other, if indeed we want to disavow empathy, as Pollock suggests, or if I'm reading her suggestion wrong, and what she's asking for is merely that we complicate how we theorize empathy. So to unpack some of that, Pollock is trying to suggest that empathy should not be the goal in performance ethnography, because a lot of these performances that are based on ethnographic text, she feels try to get the audiences to feel sorry for the people who are being represented, and therefore doesn't leave space to be critical. And I think that's a fair argument. And one of my approaches then in terms of using performance is to find spaces where the audience is not allowed to suspend disbelief, and therefore might retain a space for critical engagement, so that the subjects don't seem so precious, if that makes sense. And we can talk about that during the Q&A. Examining my performance of these men's narratives more closely, I believe that my performance does steer clear of the unmediated empathetic leap to which Pollock refers. Rather than eschew empathy, I desire to embrace it. Namely, I want to humanize these men and their lives so that the bigot that may not otherwise be predisposed to engage the story of a black gay man from the South might, in some instances, be moved to think differently about homosexuality and or about race and region. Here is where my position as an out academic might actually be put into service in a productive way, as a way to advocate on behalf of this marginalized group. For some of these men, for instance, being open about their sexuality is not an option. Not because they are not necessarily closeted in ways that are often theorized in simplistic readings of the closet or the down low, but because their sexuality is mitigated by other identity markers such as class, and race, that disavow privileging sexuality in a visibility, invisibility, out, in, binary. My role as performance ethnographer then serves as a mediator between the audience and the other in the other's absence, yet still communicates the substance of their lives in ways that alter others' perceptions and belief systems about homosexuality, and especially in the South. As a proliferation of ethnographies of LGBT communities conducted by those who are part of those communities persist, which I think is a good thing, we need to be ever mindful of how we represent ourselves in relation to our kin. In other words, how do we negotiate the terrain of the self without getting mired down in the self? A solipsistic exercise of intellectual and apolitical masturbation. How do we highlight the other and implicate ourselves in the work performance of ethnographic research? How do we negotiate the space of the other without condescension and imperialist impulses? Again, while these issues are not new, I believe that we have embarked upon a contemporary moment in which the taken for grantedness of self-reflexivity has lulled us into a quietism surrounding the ethics of the ethnographic process. The fever of solipsism has run amok. Another temperature taking is long overdue. Marlon Riggs critiqued the homophobia of the Black community in much of his work. And one memorable line from his film Tongues Untied is, "I cannot go home as who I am." After the experience I had conducting research and writing Sweet Tea, I would have to alter this line slightly to suggest that I cannot go home as who I was. For I was undeniably changed by the experience of conducting this research. I do not wish to idealize the men I interviewed or to romanticize my experience because they are not innocent subjects, and all of my experiences in the field were not easy or pleasant. But the exchange that occurred between us was more than just about me pulling out a tape recorder and gathering stories. Rather, it was about the preservation of the undocumented lives of men who have and continue to contribute to the maintenance of Black Southern life. Sweet Tea only begins to mine the multiple and rich histories waiting to be let loose and shared with the rest of the world. Indeed, they are the stories that make going home a little bit easier. And now, here are a few of the men I met along my journey back home. This should be tea.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home.
I had what I would call a tryst or two with ministers. 2 or 3 of them. 2 things happened that were significant with ministers. When I was 15, one CME minister tried to get me to leave my mother and move to another city with him. My mother is mean, and she does a lot of stuff to me, but it's like she was a known entity. That I'm not about to leave my mom and have some man use me up and throw me out, and then I wouldn't have anywhere to come back to.
That's Freddie. Freddie was born in 1944 in Madison, Georgia, but now lives in Atlanta in a home full of antiques. The interview took place on January 7th, 2005. How would you describe your childhood? Oh, God, it was awful. I was an unwanted child, an unexpected child, and an unwanted child. I'm the 5th child, but I think after 4 children, the doctors told my mother she couldn't conceive any more children. Then I came along. So I was sort of a surprise in that regard. But my father's mother was a very strong figure in my father's life. Have you seen the movie Roots? You know how they held the baby up? I kind of use that analogy. My grandmother held me up and declared that none of her blood was in me, which meant that her son was not, in fact, my father. And my father, being the weakling that he was, I think believed her. And my mother would visit my grandmother here in Atlanta. And my father's mother proclaimed that I was some, well, I won't use the N-word, but that I was some man in Atlanta's child, that I was not, in fact, his child. So that caused my grandmother and father to treat me differently. And one of the more painful examples I remember is my sister and I being out on the school ground of Bernie Street Elementary School. It's no longer there, but it was one of the colored schools in Madison, Georgia. And us running out to the edge of the schoolyard and asking my father for a nickel. And he would pull out a handful of change and give my sister a nickel. And wouldn't give me one, saying he didn't have any more. And I remember crying and that kind of thing. And I think the most painful memory I have is that of my father's cousin, AC. I do not know how that was spelled, but that's what they called him, Cousin AC. And his wife's name was Major, and their last name is Talbot. Cousin Major said to my mother one day, now my mother's name was Annabelle, but everyone called her B. She said, B, why don't you get ready to me since Aunt Avie, whose name was Eva, but everyone called her Avie. And W.S., my father. Now my father's name was Washington, Smiths and Styles, but he was simply known by his initials, W.S. anyway. She said, why don't you get ready to me since Aunt Avie and W.S. don't want him? With me standing there. And so I remember crying and hugging my mother around the legs, and I must have been very young because my mother was only 5 foot 2 inches tall, and I came at just about her knee. And I remember crying and saying, Mama, are you going to give me away? And she said, no. And there were other things, but those are the more painful memories I have of early childhood in Madison, Georgia. The other part of the story is that my father and grandmother didn't want me, but neither did my mother. Well, she was determined to keep me because her mother didn't keep her. It didn't matter how badly she abused us. Her saving grace was, at least I didn't give you away. Because my mother was given away as an infant. The story I've heard is that my grandmother was very young when my mother was born. And her father gave my mother to some other people when my grandmother wasn't at home one day. And so my mother never forgave her mother for giving her away. And she was very abusive of my sister and I. And her saving grace was always, at least I didn't give you away. So that was why she was determined to keep us no matter what. It didn't matter if she treated us like dirt. So that's the other part of the story. So for much of my life, I felt very much alone because in Madison, Georgia, I thought I had my mother. But once she got us here in Atlanta, have you seen the movie The Exorcist? I tell people that once she moved us here, her head did a 360-degree turn. And one of her favorite things to say was, if it wasn't for you, my life would have been wonderful. Just think of it. If you're a little kid, and you hear your mother say, if it wasn't for you, my life would have been wonderful, you start to think about not being here, and you hate making her life awful. And you start thinking about not being here. And so for many years, I think I was suicidal, and that was one of the issues that I dealt with in counseling. And I think that those thoughts of suicide were kind of planted there by my mother making that statement. Now in high school, even in elementary school, there was always one teacher in particular who would assign a girl to tell her if anybody bothered me when she left the room. I later found out that she was, in fact, a lesbian. She was a married lesbian. She had a husband and some children, but she was, in fact, a lesbian. So she would assign a girl to tell her. So along the way, I was kind of protected by people. You know, in high school there was always a bigger boy or someone who kind of protected me. Now the bigger boys, I never had sex with any of them. They just had a sense that I needed protecting. And something else happened. When I was in 6th grade, some boys were bothering me and the teacher kept us after school. And I would always carry a single-edged razor blade in my pocket to sharpen my pencils. Because if I went to the pencil sharpener, someone would bother me. They would put a tack in my seat or do a little something, just a little kid harassment. So, after school, the boys were going to line up to beat me up because they said it was my fault that we were kept after school. So I would always say in the sweetest little voice, because you see, I'm reasonably soft-spoken now. Leave me alone. I'm minding my business. Don't bother me. And this boy ran up to hit me, and I cut across the shoulder with my razor blade. By that time, the teacher came back. She said, "You boys better go home." The last thing I heard him say was, "You're a mean little sissy. I'm going to have your ass locked up." I went home. Didn't say anything to my mother. And bravely the next day, I went to school. And the same boy came up to me, and he had a hairline cut across his shoulder because I had cut through 2 or 3 layers of clothing. He said, "You better be glad." I said, "Listen, do not bother. I keep telling you to leave me alone. I want to be left alone. I'm not bothering you. Don't bother me." And what always happened, if anyone attacked me, they always ended up seeing some of their own blood. Because I would bite them or hit them with a sharp object, but they always ended up seeing some of their own blood. And because I was so supple, there was nothing I couldn't get out of. And I could run if I had to run. So rumors spread. Don't bother him. He's a mean little sissy. And he's stronger than he loves. That's Freddie.
In the house, we slept on mattresses with moss and chinches. You ain't never seen a chinchon?
A chinchon?
Yeah, a chinch.
A chinchon.
It's a little bug, it's a bug, and it sucks blood. Hardly a million of them, and you just be killing chinches like nobody's business. Next morning after you done killed a bug, or how many next morning you get up there, 88, and suck all your bugs. You have a million more to kill.
That's Countess Vivian. Countess Vivian was the oldest black Southerner I interviewed. He was 93 at the time. He just passed away this past September at the age of 99, 2 months shy of his 100th birthday. He was born on November 12, 1912 in New Orleans and lived most of his life there. Right before he died, he lived in the Tremé area. The interview took place on January the 22nd, 2005 at his home in New Orleans. Was there a gay community here in New Orleans in the 20s and 30s? Oh yeah, child, I hope to tell you, but I did not know or realize that they had white sissies. Because they lived on the other side of the tracks. Because the railroad used to run way beyond Canal Street there, you know, right beyond Rampart there. And the gay bars were all black, just like they got today. Just like they got the lesbians today. There were many black lesbians. But just like I said, I didn't know because we didn't see any white gay people. Because everything over here was segregated. And the only time you would come over here in a French Quarter would be if you was working. You would come over here and scrub the floor or clean the toilet or something like that. But you couldn't come over here and say, I'm going to buy me a drink or sit in a bar or something like that. You couldn't do that. But you could have in your own areas on the other side of the tracks. Well, so were there a lot of black gay bars? Oh yeah, child, I hope to tell you. There was not a lot of them, but not as many as they got the white gay bars. But there were many black bars because I was young. And all these children, they were older, but I saw them and knew them, you know. Because most of them used to drink wine. And during Prohibition, they had a place where they go make the wine. But it was really good. I don't know what they was making it with. It was really good. It'd be ice cold and just one sip of it make you kind of dizzy, you know. It was really good. And all the blacks would be all in their place together, and the gay people would be all in their place. And of course, you could go almost any place, you know. But just like they got the white gay bars and the black gay bars, back then it was a black gay bars. And the only difference was the blacks stayed in their place and the whites stayed in their place. So what was going on in these bars? Were they sit-around bars, or could you dance? Well, they had a piano. You put a little nickel in the piano, they play a tune, you could dance. And that was before the music boxes came, and we called them the funky book places, you know. And, because the ballrooms at that time had sawdust all on the floor, you see. And they may be 2 or 3 little pieces of music. They have a horn and a drum or something like that. And you go back there and you dance like nobody's business. Well, how did the people find out about these bars? Were there signs outside? Oh no, baby, not during Prohibition. Wasn't no signs because it wasn't allowed, you know. The bars wasn't allowed. Now, after Prohibition, the bars were open. But during Prohibition, they was called at that time the speakeasies. And all you have to do was know somebody where the speakeasy was. Because it'd be like a little club. And they give you a little card or something like that. And they let you in the place. Just like during election times, in those days, they were supposed to be closed up, black. But what they do, they put a sheet or something like that over the liquor, and you couldn't see what was behind it, but they'd be right open and selling their liquor underneath the counter. Well, what were some of the names that gay people were called back then? Was Sissy the main name? Were there other, you know, derogatory names that they called gay people? Well, let's see, we had Hazel, a little short, half raggedy child. That's because we had 2 Hazel. And to differentiate between the 2, we say black Hazel and brown Hazel. Because one of them was brown and short, and the other one was tall and dark skinned. So we say black Hazel and brown Hazel. And we had Saul, and he used to live with his mother, but he used to dream too. And we had another one, Monroe, and we had Magnolia Gold, and he used to hustle. And we had Pearl, and Pearl used to hustle. But I had a house over on Iberville Street, where the project is today. The project wasn't there back then. And they, of course, they had several other houses over on Bienville, and those streets over in that area. They had several houses where the black gays lived, and some of them, you know, they owned little pieces of property, you know, and that was all before the district closed. And they had several others. I can't remember them sisters' names. Let me see. Like Dan Bradley and Morris Coleman. They had 2 or 3 named Moses. You know, and most of them used to work on the stores on Canal Street. And some of them, no, most of them were cooks. And they go to the market before they go to work. And before they go to work, they go and get a little drink or something like that. And then they get their little stuff together. Then they go to work. I'm trying to think some more of them names. I can't remember them sissies' names. I actually just can't remember. Well, were there drag queens back then? Oh yeah, John, today. We had a couple of them. More than a couple of them, because they used to hustle too in dresses, like Julia Pimpé. These people died way years ago. In fact, all these people I mentioned, they died years ago. Like Julia Pimpé and several others. They used to put on dresses and hustle at night. And they wouldn't have nothing in the room but that bed and that one chair. And that chair be like right at that door there. And that bed be way over there somewhere. And because, you know, back then, the rooms were large. They didn't have no small rooms. The houses had large rooms. And they had somebody in that room right there. And they called them the creepers. Because they were creepy. come in the door. Creep to come in the door. And while the trick was busy doing his business, they go in his pocket and steal his money. That went on for God knows how long, honey. That's why they didn't have that in the room, you see, because if it got to be too big a haul, they had to get out there, right? Because many times the person that got robbed would go get the police. And then many times the person that got robbed wouldn't go get the police because they'd be too ashamed to let them know they was up there with those black hookers. If they didn't know, you know, it was a sissy, they thought it was a woman. And even if they did know it was a real woman, they'd be too ashamed to let them know if they was up there with those blacks. Because you know at that time, blacks and whites wasn't close. Because they're not all that close now. But then too, they were further apart than we are today. So let me get this straight. Sometimes these were white men picking up black tranny hookers. Well, no, baby, not sometimes, always. Always white. No black men, honey, no black men. Even the black women that hustle, they didn't fool around with those black guys. Why? Because they didn't have any money? That's right, that's right. You go where the money is, don't fool around wasting your damn time with those blacks. Because a lot of those black guys were pimps. And the women would hustle and they'd give them money and they'd be dressing looking like little princes and all that stuff. Well, when did you first realize that you were gay? Oh, Lord, child, must have been a little baby child. Like that, you know, right away. I don't know what caused it. It just come right on, you know. You know, of course, I knew I was different from the rest of the guys because all of them, they didn't want no little boy. They was looking for little girls. But still, I don't know. It just came on. I guess it's like they say, it's born in you. I don't think anybody makes you do it. If it ain't in you to be that way, you ain't gonna be. That's the way I look at it. So you've remained pretty healthy, huh? Yeah, of course, in '83, I developed cancer of the colon. And I had an operation. And I had therapy, radiation therapy for about 6 to 8 weeks. And I was told at that time, if I were to live for 5 years, I'd be doing all right. Well, I done lived. I done this since '83, so I guess I'll keep on going. So you really enjoy life, don't you? That's right, honey. I want to tell you, don't let them send me in that chair, holding my hand and twiddling my thumbs, and you know, that's not going to help at all, except to worry about this and worry about that. You know, I just don't let things worry me. And I don't have too many eggs, you know, just sometimes I get a little stiff. But once I start moving all about, it's all gone, you know. And the only medications I take is I got my aspirin and I keep my Alka-Seltzer. And then to keep my beauty up, I use my olive oil. That's right, child. Well, I can see it's really working. I will tell you. Because I know people who's way younger than me who look worse than me. So I say I'm blessed. And I got a couple of teeth if I want to put them in my mouth. But I don't want to wear them. That's Countess.
To be a home and black. I got into theater by mistake. I actually enrolled in like PE or something. PE was full. I got in the class. The first day of class, she's like, okay, we're going to start and give introductions. And I stood up and I gave my name. And I was being a smart ass. I made it by accident. Hopefully I can get my schedule changed. And I sat down. That was the end of it. And I went up to her after the class and I was like, what do I need to do to get a schedule changed? She's like, I don't think I'm going to let you out of the class. She's like, there's something about your voice that reminds me so much of Sidney Poitier, your presence. And I was like, here we go again. Why do you go thinking black folks that are like, I had no idea who he was. No idea.
That's Stephen. Stephen was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1982, but was raised in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. My interview with Stephen Stephen stayed with me for days after because of the intensity of our meeting. The interview took place on November the 2nd, 2004, on the campus of the University of Alabama. I had these feelings since I could remember. It had always been along the lines of I was just wired differently. Just wired differently. Growing up, being around my sisters, I was really, really effeminate. And I would get beat up a lot because of that. And so what I decided is that I would look at the other boys that was considered normal, and I would tailor my behavior to that. And it got to the point where I really got good at it. Really good at it. And it got to the point where it wasn't an issue anymore because, it got to the point where it stressed out my family so much. And I vividly remember my mom saying, "Don't you grow up to be no faggot." I vividly remember hearing that. And you're getting beat up in school because you're a faggot, you're a little girl, you're a sissy. And she was like, "Everybody is telling you this is wrong." So I fixed it. I'm going to fix it. I'm not going to hang around my sisters as much anymore. I'm going to change. I'm going to change who I am. So I got to college, and I was known as the only straight guy in the theater department. I really got good at it. Really good at it. Which entailed what? The way you walked, the way you talked. Exactly. That's the thing, because I was raised around my sisters. And, and it was my mom and my sisters and me, and women pretty much ran the house, so everything was pretty much done on that level. So my closest friends were my sisters, and we were always together, and we acted alike. And I felt like I was being punished for being this way. And as my sister got older, she was like, "Quit hanging around me and my friends." So from every angle, I was being told, "You've got it wrong." So I fixed it. I fixed it. I fixed what I thought people thought was wrong about me and what I thought was wrong. It's so funny because I had girlfriends. I treated them awesome. It makes me now wonder how much of, how it makes me wonder because I'm still looked at as being straight acting, masculine, although I'm out. And sometimes it makes me wonder how much of this is really me. Or how much is something I just changed to fit in? Because me coming out was solely something that I thought I had to do for myself because I was exhausted. I stopped going to my church because right before I got to college, the pressure was so much. It was so much all the time. It got to the point where I really wanted to kill myself. I wanted to kill myself because of how deeply rooted I was in the church. I wanted to die, rather than continue to displease the God that I love so much. Since I can't stop these feelings that everybody's telling me is wrong, I would prefer to die and to be able to say that I'm going to heaven than continue to live this way and go to hell because of this. So I struggled, and I hated myself for it. When I got to college, I pulled away from all these things. I pulled away from what I've been taught, the people around my life, and I really began to look for who I was, and it got to the point to where I came to a realization. I believe in a God who's all-knowing. I believe in a God that doesn't make mistakes. I believe in a God that has created me. I believe that I'm not a mistake. I believe that this is where I was created. I didn't choose it. Who would choose it? It used to frustrate me so much being in the closet early on. I hear people say, it's a choice, it's a lifestyle change. It's like, you don't understand my struggle. I've tried that. I read up on ex-gay therapies. I've tried to be what you thought Stephen should be, and I'm exhausted. I was headed for destruction. I was either going to have to come to terms with this because it was something that I was ignoring for a long time, ignoring this fight within myself that was killing me, and I got to the point where I was like, no. From now on, what I believe is going to be something that's true for me and who Stephen is, and not something that I've been fed since I was smaller. So I started to examine my relationship with my family. Because it's so easy to be loved for something that you're not, than to be hated for something that you are. It's so easy. You know what I mean? So I started to examine my relationship with God, my Christian faith. Because when I got to college, I started to read about all these people who weren't like me, you know, who weren't black, who weren't Christian. And I started to read Mahatma Gandhi. It's so odd because, you know, we held Martin Luther King as being the man. Well, Gandhi would have been Martin Luther King's man. So I read about all the things that he did, how he freed his people nonviolently, how he took on the British Army, and then he died. So I started to think. I believed that you could only go to heaven if you believed in Jesus Christ. I started to sit with myself, and I was like, so what people are telling me is that Mahatma Gandhi is in hell? So everything about everything I believed in, I started to reevaluate. You're telling me that God hates me because of the way that he made me? Mahatma Gandhi is in hell? I mean, it was so liberating to be like, no! No. It's so funny. I guess the first time I honestly started to think about it, I was like 17, 16. I had a girlfriend. And really wasn't interested in the physical anything with her. I really wasn't, but this was something that both of our families approved of. And the sex thing was always an issue. Sex was always an issue until I finally said, well, for me to prove myself as a man, we gotta have sex. The first time we had sex, I fathered my son. And it's like, although he's someone who motivates me, someone when I get exhausted or when I really start to be like, what am I working towards? He motivates me past those moments. But it was one of the earliest moments where I was like, you came to this point being something that you're not. That's Stephen. The last one, Duncan.
I am a fantasy. Come down, put the bass in your walk. Catch out, let your whole body talk.
I'm very careful about this one because I don't buy the mythology that black folks are more homophobic than anybody else. And the reason I don't buy it is because I grew up knowing gay people who my parents knew, and they were all in the church. And I'm not talking subtly gay, I'm talking Flaming Queen, who ran the choirs. I met James Cleveland as a child, and the Troubadours, who were an all-male group, and none of them were butch. And I met the Hawkins family. Yes, I'm going to say, I met Edwin and Walter Hawkins before they were out, some of them. I won't out all of them, but I will say those that are out now, I met them before they were out.
Duncan Teague. Duncan would not tell me his exact year of birth. He would only say that I was born sometime in the early 1960s. Diva extraordinaire. He's the only narrator in Sweet Tea that insisted that I use his first and last name. He's just that fierce. Duncan is very much an activist, and most everyone in Atlanta knows him. The interview took place on November the 1st, 2004 at his home in Atlanta. How do you feel about the life choices that you've made in light of being a black, gay man? My next door neighbor, who shall remain nameless, is Mexican-American. His father's first generation, I think. His wife is a white lady from the South. And they have two beautiful children. And they've been very dear to me and David. But they just broke up. She moved to an apartment with the two children Saturday and Sunday. And so I was comforting a straight man who's coming to terms with how to get his family back or get his life in order so that he can be happy with himself, his wife, and his children. And whatever I've done, I've never ended up in that predicament. I came home to my lover of 11 years tonight, and I've never been so fucking grateful in my life that I don't have that level of hurt and needing to do something about my life to get it together again. At least at this particular point in time, I'm so happy about the current decisions I've made, staying with David, going back to be with David, living with David, marrying David, all in opposition to all the stuff that I've been brought up to believe in. And establishing a home with David, a home we felt we'd welcome family into. I've had my cousins here, I've had my stepmother here, and they love him. Yeah. I can't say I'm proud of every decision, but at least by some miracle, and I do mean it's a miracle, because we weren't always insane. And we were popular and pretty and younger. I've made some decisions that have allowed me to be negative of HIV, but yet still involved in the epidemic, because my status has not prevented me from being infected and affected in other ways. Some folks say it might be crazy. I might say that someday. But I think the big decision early on around being black and gay, and not something else, but being black and gay, is the one that I'm most proud of. I've not suffered through a so-called marriage to a woman. We won't go into other things, but to a woman. And my relationships with men were honest relationships. They didn't work, but they were honest. And I've loved men as fully as I possibly could. And I feel like I've been blessed for that. And I've loved women as a gay man, not as a straight man, but as a gay man. And I feel like I've been rewarded for that. I've lived a full life, baby. If this tape were to accidentally get struck by lightning and I were to accidentally get struck too, because it would be an accident, you know the memorial service is going to be humongous. Because I've accomplished a few things in this skin. And you know, the program won't just read, you know, black and gay, but if you need to print in there, kind of sissified, a little soft around the edges, and occasionally a vicious thing, and sometimes in drag, and sometimes pretty in drag, and not just in drag. Yeah. Wow, I hadn't thought about that. I'm glad you asked me that. I'm glad I hung on to some of that and questioned it. I don't need to be strangled by anything. So no, I have no regrets. For you see, I am black. I am gay. I am the South. Miss South. Thank you. So I think we have a few minutes for questions. This is actually my favorite part of presenting this work, is having a chance to engage with you, either about the theoretical, methodological aspects of the work, or the things about the performance, the process, so on and so forth. So, questions? Yes?
Thank you so much. I do have a question regarding the, have they seen you, and what have their reactions been?
It's a great question that I get quite a bit, and the answer is yes. I have two versions of the show. I have this version, which I call the Vagina Monologues version. But it's also a full production version, still a solo performance, but I have a set and I fully embody it, and I also tell my own story. It's interwoven. And the first time I performed this version in Atlanta, Freddie, who's cutting people with his knife, and Duncan T, the diva, both were in the audience. And during the Q&A, Freddie came up on stage with me. And he said to the audience, "That story that Dr. Johnson just performed is one of my favorite stories to You know I'm in almost every chapter of the book. And I will be joining him afterwards in signing my pages in the book. And he did. And Junkin didn't come on stage with me, but he raised his hand. And he said, Dr. Johnson, you're performing my narrative, and I have not received my royalty. But those two in particular have been very supportive of me performing the stories. When this became a full-fledged theater production that premiered in Chicago in 2010, the producer flew 8 of the men up for the premiere, and then there were 5 others who whose stories weren't performed in the show, but who were in Sweet Tea, and all 13 of them did a talk back, and it was the first time some of them had met each other, and I was on stage. It was a very moving experience for them and for me, and all of them kept saying how overwhelming seeing the show was, because they felt honored just to be included in the book, but then to have their lives portrayed on stage and people come see their lives being portrayed on stage meant a lot to them. And my worry, of course, always is about not making a caricature of them. And that's a fine line that I have to walk. So one of the best compliments that I can receive as a performer about this show is that I can tell through your performance that you care about these men. So I hope that comes through. But I'm in touch with many of the men still, because you can't walk out of their lives. Countess Vivian is perhaps my favorite to perform, and the person with whom I became really, really close to, because of his age, but also because of his resilience as a person to live a century I can't even imagine. And he survived Hurricane Katrina and didn't leave his home. And I interviewed him in January of 2005. Of course, in August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit. So from August of 2005 till August of 2009, I lost touch with him. And of course, I thought he had perished in the storm. This is where I really believe in divine intervention. I would search the internet, every few months, obits.com, trying to find out information, see if he had passed away. And nothing ever came up there. And then out of the blue, I received an email from my publisher from the University of North Carolina Press, which was a forwarded email from a person by the name of Willis Saunders in Oakland, California. Willis had gone to the Barnes & Noble in Oakland to purchase a Bible, and decided he would go in the gay and lesbian section. I love that segue. To see what was over there. And saw a copy of Sweet Tea, and it was the hardcover version, lying face down. On the back cover, on the jacket of Sweet Tea, is a picture of Countess Vivian. And he said, "That looks like George." His real name is George Egerson. So he picked up the book and started flipping through it and found George's story. And in the hardcover version, I say that, I've lost touch with him and hadn't been able to find him. I updated it in the soft cover version. So he said to himself, George is still alive. I know how to get in touch with him. So he emailed my publisher and said, "Please get this message to Professor Johnson. I know how to get in touch with Countess Vivian." So I called him. He gave me the Countess's number. I called him. He picked up the phone. And I was just, overcome with joy. And so I went, a month later, I flew back down to New Orleans, and my partner, who's a television news producer, went with me. He filmed our reunion and made a little documentary called In Search of Countess Vivian. And if you go on YouTube and look at and look up In Search of Countess Vivian, you can see the documentary and see him narrating his life, and particularly about surviving Hurricane Katrina. And I was really, really hoping that he would make 100. And he was just 2 months shy of it. So these men mean a lot to me. Their stories mean a lot to me. Again, I don't want to portray them as precious. They are flawed, as we all are. But I think that their stories are really powerful, and I think that no matter what your own identity, if you're not black, and you're not gay, or you're not from the South, there are things in these stories that people can relate to because they're about the human condition. Thank you for that question. Yes?
You said your youngest was 19. Was there a difference, like with how they were interacted with you or reacted, just because they were younger and a little bit more accepted nowadays?
You know, that's the interesting thing. I thought it would be the younger people that I interviewed whose stories were a little more about being accepted or whatever, but they were the ones who felt, and I think part of that had to do with the time period in which I was doing these interviews. It was 2004, when there was a huge backlash against the LGBT community, and when black churches in particular were aligning themselves with George Bush administration, because they were receiving lots of funding from the government. So a lot of people felt, I don't want to say threatened, but they were really hesitant to be open about their sexuality, and particularly young people, whereas the older people were more like, F it, I don't care, here's my life. So Stephen, for instance, was a college student. He was 21 at the time of the interview. He's one of the youngest people that I interviewed. Tortured soul. Talking about how he had to tailor his behavior to butch it up so that he didn't get picked on. And this would have been in the 90s. We're not talking a long time ago. Late 90s, early 2000s. And felt so pressured that he got a girlfriend and then, has a child. So I found, ironically, that it was the younger people who had a tougher time, in terms of how they narrate the story, than the older people. That's not to say that the older men didn't have horrible stories, but they came through it, and their perspective on it was a little different. Hey, I see what you did.
Can you talk about honeypot for a little bit?
So I'm doing the follow-up to Sweet Tea called Honeypot. Don't you love these titles? And it came about because, I should back up. When I began doing the research for Sweet Tea, it actually was going to include black lesbians. And as we're wont to do, the gay men just took over the book, just took it over. And I had 3,000 pages of transcript. And so there was no way I could include both. And so when I started performing, I started going to at different universities or communities. Inevitably, there would be black lesbians in the audience who said, "When are you going to tell our story? When are we going to have pink lemonade?" Which was, I toyed around with that title. And I thought that once Sweet Tea came out, that someone would do a book on black lesbians in the South, but it didn't happen. And so I decided that, I would do it. And so far I've interviewed 33 women. The youngest is 18, the oldest 74, and I have about 40 more to do. And the stories are very different, as you can imagine. There's lots and lots of stories about sexual violence at the hands of male relatives. And that was really disturbing to me, and I had to take a break from doing the interviews because of that. It's not really funny, but in in 2 instances, I was so traumatized by the experience and just lost it, just crying like a baby. The person I was interviewing was consoling me. It's okay, baby, it's all right. It's all right. I'm like, you're the one that had the experience and I'm the one, falling out. So I had to take a break because I was having nightmares about, it was really intense. And that was one thing that I didn't anticipate. I knew, in The Color Purple, no.
Sure.
No.
Yeah, Silly. Is that silly?
No. Oprah Winfrey's character.
Oh, Sophia.
Sophia says, a girl child ain't safe in the house of men's. And I'm thinking that's going to be a chapter title. So I knew that, that many women would have that experience. I just didn't realize it would be so many. So I've done 33 interviews, 26 of the 33 have experienced some kind of sexual trauma, violence. So that was really, really painful to bear witness to that story over and over again. The other thing that has been an emerging theme is most of the women have had relationships with men. And they talk about how the relationships were good, but there being a lack of an emotional connection. And the first time that they have sex with a woman, light bulbs go off and fireworks and all this kind of thing. Many of them do not like the term lesbian. And they prefer gay, which was surprising to me. A couple of them, academics, prefer queer. And a few saying gender loving. So I don't think the subtitle of the book is going to be Black Lesbians of the South, because I always like to follow the lead of my interlocutors. So I think it's going to be Honeypot, Southern Black Women Who Love Women, and Oral History. Because a lot of the women talk about not wanting any kind of label. They say, I just love women. So the other thing is, and this is always the question I get when people find out I'm doing Honeypot, are you going to perform the stories? And I haven't made up my mind about whether I'm going to perform the stories. I do think it will be a performance, but I don't know if I will perform them. I'll certainly, read excerpts and stuff when I'm doing academic presentations, but I don't know if I will, in the way that I do these stories. But the other thing is the women are not as dramatic in their telling of the stories. The men just carry on. There's all these colorful characters, but the women, there are a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, they're not as dramatic in the telling of the story, even though they're narrating very dramatic events. Their telling of the story is not as dramatic. Yes?
How do you select your interviewees?
For Sweet Tea, I started out with people that I knew. I'm from North Carolina, so I started out with people that I knew there and in Atlanta, and then it literally was a snowball effect. And the only criteria is that you were born in the South, raised in the South, and that you're currently living in the South. Some of the people that I've interviewed moved away from the South for a little while and then moved back, and that's fine, but those are the criteria: born, raised, and currently live in the South. For Honeypot, that boundary is going to be stretched a little, not in terms of region per se, but I'm going, and the oldest person I've interviewed is 74, and she is Afro-Latina. And she is very adamant about being Black. And in her narrative, her name is Ada Renta, and she's a firecracker. I love her. I actually interviewed her in Puerto Rico. And she talks about having to, how did she say it? I had to get my Black lesbian sisters together because they were questioning my authenticity. Don't they know that the slave ships stopped in the islands first? So there's going to be a little more flexibility in terms of how the book is defined, but yeah. Yes?
I wonder, in light of your formulation of ethnography is critical, or critical ethnography is advocacy, how you sort of deal with subjects or interlocutors whose politics you don't agree with, or who you don't like personally. You seem to have a very warm relationship with the people that you performed here, but I just wondering sort of how you deal with that both theoretically and practically.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually talked about that this afternoon with the graduate students. There are a number of these men that I did not like. But that's also important to include those stories because it's not a monolithic story. Their experiences are not monolithic, and many of the interviews I did were with people whose politics are way to the right of mine, including one that I do perform actually, Jerome, who in the interview was trying to save me. And he's interesting because, and I've talked about this all day, about how as humans, we're contradictory. We're walking contradictions. He is a classic example of this. This is someone who is functionally illiterate and who is this wonderful tailor, and he can sew his behind off. But he feels that God, he can pray his gayness away, and talks a lot about that, how he's sort of, given up the life, but at the same time has this fascinating critique about gay bashing in the church. And both of those things exist. I'm going to pray my gayness away. These preachers need to stop gay bashing. Both of those things exist within this, same person. There's this one moment in the interview when she says to me, "Do you believe it's right? Do you believe that anybody who has a drop of God in them knows that it's wrong? These people with these DDDs and DDs and PhDs behind their name, talking about me, he was signifying. Don't you know it's wrong?" So I'm just sitting there, it ain't about me, it's about you. So I talk about that in the book when before each narrative, before each person is introduced in the book, I do a little bit of framing of them, how I met them, and where they're from, and so on and so forth. And then I talk about that with Jerome. So I think that it's what makes the book so rich is to include people who some might describe as self-hating. Because I don't want to pass judgment on these folks, but I do want to present the complexity of their lives, even when their politics or ideology strays from mine. How are we doing on time?
I think we probably should wind it down, and
Okay.
we can take some of the questions to the reception.
So I like to end with a story. I love to, maybe two stories. But so a lot of times people ask me, well, how did you find, somebody asked me that, how did I find some of these men? So one of the ways I found some of these men is through straight black women whose BFF is a gay man. And one of the women who helped me find folks, her name is Ann McCarthy. She lives in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and she's the sister of one of my mentors, Trudeau Harris. So she is actually who set me up with Jerome, who's a childhood friend who lives 5 doors down. That's an important detail that you need to remember later on in the story. So I flew down to Tuscaloosa to go to meet Jerome at Ann's house. And she was going to prepare Sunday dinner. Now, those of you who are not from the South, Sunday dinner does not mean at night, it means after church. And depending on what denomination, it could be noon, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, or 4 o'clock. She's Pentecostal Kojic, so you know it's at 4 o'clock. So those of you who also are not from the South, may not realize that Sunday dinner is a big deal, and it means 4 or 5 different meats and a lot of vegetables cooked within an inch of their lives in fat land. And red Kool-Aid, not cherry. So Ann made the spread for Jerome, for herself and me. And he was supposed to show up at 4 o'clock. 4:30 comes, 5 o'clock, no Jerome. So she gets on the phone with Jerome. Jerome, where are you? We're waiting on you. Patrick's already started eating. He comes up with some excuse about why he can't come. I'm going to come back to that story. Ann is really, really pissed because I've flown all the way down from Chicago to interview Jerome, and he doesn't come. This can only happen in the South. She takes out the phone book, starts going through the phone book, trying to find men who she thinks is gay. To come over for me to interview. And I'm sitting there eating my fried chicken, potato salad, collard greens, candy yams, smothered chicken, going, oh my God. So she would get on the phone with these people, and again, like a good Southerner, she never got right to the point. You got a war, so she would go on about, oh, I didn't see you at church today, how your mom and them, they got a sale going on down at the Kmart. So on and so forth. Then she finally get around to, well, one of Trudier's former students is here. She got all these students, they just coming through this stuff. And he's writing a book on black men in the South. Okay. And the person would hang up on him. So she calls this one man, another neighbor, Rob. And she goes on her whole thing about, how you doing? I haven't seen you in a long time, so on and so forth. And she said, well, the reason I called Rob is because, one of Trudy's students down here, he's doing this book on black men in the South who are gay. And I thought that you would come over. And then I hear this boom over the phone. And I ain't gay, I'm not coming over there and talking to that boy. She does not miss a beat. She said, Rob, you gay. Your wife know you gay. Your children know you gay. Come over here and get us what it's going to be. Do this, we're going to back into the South. So I was down. I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. And the funny thing is, she got somebody to come over and interview. That she had never had a conversation with about being gay. So that's one of my favorite stories to tell about being on the road. And the final one I tell is about going to Mobile, Alabama. And usually I do the show at college campuses, so it's fine, whatever. But sometimes I do the show in communities, and I was invited by the main library in Mobile, Alabama, to do the show. And I was like, this is going to be really interesting. So I go down to Mobile, and the audience is 99.9% white, the way this one is now. Except the average age, I would say, was 75. Yeah. So I was like, oh my God, this is going to be really interesting. Like, here they are. They're coming in slowly, but coming in. And, my favorite part of the show is the Q&A, but I was not looking forward to the Q&A. But, to their credit, the audience was great. They were responding. Some people were crying. It was very moving, whatever. But I still wasn't looking forward to the Q&A. So we get to the Q&A, and a couple of people asked me, a couple of questions, and then a minister stands up. And I was like, oh, here we go. White minister stands up. He says, Dr. Johnson, we're so happy to have you here in Mobile, Alabama. We need to talk more about sexuality and spirituality. Because God was there for the first wet vagina. And God was there for the first erection. And he said, it is good. favorite stories to tell. Thank you so much, and I'll see you.
So again, if you want to stay around, there's a reception in the Great Hall.